The leader of the first expedition to attempt to reach the South Pole was British naval officer Robert F. Scott. He arrived at Ross Island in 1902 and began assembling the Discovery hut. Named after his ship, this hut was designed for the Australian outback. This poor design was one of the many mistakes that Scott made on this first expedition. Scott used this hut as a stepping-off point to begin his journey to the South Pole. Because of the cold temperatures and low humidity, the hut remains today much as it was for Scott and other explorers at the turn of the century. Unfortunately for Scott, the poor construction left the hut cold and drafty. He ended up using it for storage, and him and his men wintered aboard their ship. This hut played a role in other expeditions as well. Scott set out to try and reach the South Pole with a handful of men. Unfortunately, they ran out of supplies and had to turn around. One crew member, Ernest Shackleton, developed scurvy and was eventually sent home to England against his will. This set up a rivalry between the two men that would last until Scott's death in 1913. Scott returned again in the British Antarctic expedition of 1910 to 1913, aboard the ship the Terra Nova. This is Scott's second hut, named after the British Antarctic expedition of 1910 and 1913, the Terra Nova. Scott had learned a great deal from the mistakes made on the Discovery expedition. The Terra Nova hut was a vast improvement in design and was successful in keeping him and his men warm during their second expedition. Scott and his crew used shipping crates to erect walls. This kept the crew separate from the officers and from Scott himself. You can see that the kitchen is still fully stocked with everything from cocoa powder to oatmeal. The stove was used to both cook and to heat the hut. The canned goods and spices remain untouched to this day. The hut provided housing for the 25-man Terra Nova shore party from 1911 to 1913. It was a stepping-off point for his 5-man crew to head to try to reach the South Pole. The Terra Nova was first and foremost a science expedition. Scott and 4 of his men were successful in reaching the South Pole. However, they were not the first to do so. Ronald Edmondson, on December 14th of 1911, beat him by about a month. Unfortunately, Scott and his 4 men perished on the way back from the South Pole, just miles from reaching their supply hut. Ernest Shackleton's Ross Sea Party was the last to use the hut between 1915 and 1917. On January 17th, Shackleton picked up his men and left the hut locked and fully stocked. This cross was erected outside the Terra Nova hut in memory of Ernest Shackleton's men from the Ross Sea Party that perished during their expedition. Due to the efforts of New Zealand's Antarctic Heritage Trust, this hut remains in much the same condition as it was when Ernest Shackleton left in 1917. In July of 1907, Ernest Shackleton set out on a small ship called the Nimrod to try and beat Robert Scott to the South Pole. Shackleton had promised his former captain that he would not enter McMurdo Sound, but he ended up being forced to use it because of ice. He landed and established the hut Nimrod at Cape Royds. His landing party consisted of 14 men, 15 Manchurian ponies, 9 dogs, and a 15-horsepower motor car. In late 1908, he led a party of 4 to try and reach the South Pole. Unfortunately, he had to turn around 97 miles from reaching his destination because of short supplies. Shackleton learned that both Edmondson and Scott had beat him to the South Pole. In his next expedition, he changed his goal. Shackleton took the Endurance to the opposite side of Antarctica and had his Ross Sea Party come to Ross Island to lay out supplies. Unfortunately, the Endurance was crushed by sea ice, and Shackleton barely escaped with his life and the life of his crew. In 1917, Shackleton was finally able to make it back to rescue his crew from the Ross Sea Party. This hut also remains today as it was in 1917 when Shackleton and his men left for the last time.